Hi, thank you very much for coming to my TED Talk. Please get a good look at our lovely audience here. Everybody should go ahead and wave, everybody. At least one cat is here as well, so wonderful day. So, today we're talking about the ethics of museum outreach. Museums are infamously a very complicated institution. They're an institution with, ironically enough, a very complicated history. While they've been a very important part of preserving history for communities around the world, they've also been an integral part in destroying a lot of it and defacing it. Museums are often imagined as safe spaces for unsafe ideas, which is a term credited to Elaine Human-Garland from 2018. But it's increasingly clear that the concept of safe space for safe ideas does not include safety for the people viewing them. In many situations, institutions display their information, display their artifacts, especially historically, in ways that are harmful to the communities that they've come from. One of the most obvious examples of this is the theft of artifacts from cultures around the planet. I don't know if you've ever had somebody steal something from you, but I think it gets to a certain level when they not only steal it from you, but steal it in your view, walk out with it, because they're bigger than you and stronger than you. And then instead of hiding what they've stolen, put it in a big glass box with a bunch of lighting on it, make sure it looks really good. One example a lot of people talk about is the British History Museum in London, but I think something we don't think about as much is the American theft of artifacts. The Met, Metropolitan Museum of Art, does actually have more than 1,000 artifacts as of, I think, 2023 when this was written. Over 1,000 artifacts that can be traced to looting and trafficking illegally of artifacts from countries like Greece, countries like Italy, India, Egypt, and Cambodia, and all over the world. And part of this policy comes from the sort of like competitive nature of museums. In the 1960s, American museums were very far behind museums in Europe. Obviously, they had a couple hundred years extra to like steal stuff. Sorry, Professor. Two curses in class. And this led them to take a very aggressive and casual approach to acquiring artifacts. Like how I aggressively and casually swear on camera in my presentation for class. Another interesting part is the destruction of artifacts. Historically, one of the biggest examples, mummies from Egypt. There's a shortage of mummies around the world. They've been going extinct, not because they're rotting away, because they've A, been destroyed in the process of moving them out, and B, people kept eating them. There was this medicinal substance called mumi, which you would take from mummies. You just chop up a mummy, essentially, grind them up, and you give it to like royalty or rich people, and they thought it had healing properties, that the spirit of the pharaoh would heal them.
It's gross.
And the reason I bring this up is a large part of the modern day museum institution's kind of goals for reconstruction is to get the consent of those that they are representing. And in the case of dead bodies, especially of remains, having the consent of the descendants of the person or the community they came from is incredibly important for properly representing that community. I'd love to get a question from the audience. Where do you think this exhibit was set up? What museum in America do you think was set up? You think it was like a museum of indigenous culture? Maybe? Probably?
No.
So probably not is the audience. Yeah. So this is an exhibit from the National History Museum of the Smithsonian. Now, I don't know about you guys. Natural history to me seems like it should be about animals and plants and natural phenomena and not people. I think this goes a long way to show the sort of neo-colonialist ideas that have been continued to be perpetuated by museums that are not taking steps to repair that. A quote that I loved about this was somebody described it, museums such as this as the gun that shoots twice. That in the initial acquisition of the artifacts, which is usually part of colonial conquest historically, and that it then perpetuates colonial stereotypes about the people it's coming from while it's being preserved in museums. This exhibit was actually taken down, I think a year ago now, because federal regulations have been updated that you must have consent of the people being represented to represent artifacts, especially from Native Americans, North American indigenous peoples. And that's what this article is about. If you and thinking about the broader story and history of museums and natural history museums in particular, that no matter what story you're trying to tell in a museum, whatever history you're trying to represent, it's going to involve people. And I think we have historically done a very bad job of making sure that those people are treated as people when we're creating our exhibitions, rather than a part of the exhibit itself. And it creates a lot of false narratives when you're not thinking about the people that you're representing. And I think that's something that a lot of modern museums have been doing a lot of work towards rehabilitating. So why have they been rehabilitating lately? Why do we care? Why are people suddenly caring about if you're, creating neo-colonialist stereotypes about people in your museum? On the one aspect of things, obviously, I think society has progressed a great deal in that aspect. Part of that, which is interesting, a lot of museums that I've seen online, some articles I've read, have represented this as a change in percentages. That obviously, as time is going on, the vast majority of people, the people who used to be going to museums, were all white, right? And as that sort of divide lowers, I mean, by 2050, there's going to be a larger percentage of minority populations in America than the majority white Americans like myself. And I think people are finally realizing, because people coming to museums have the perspective of the people being put on display, for lack of a better term, that it is so much more obvious now for those visiting museums, for those running museums who are part of these cultures, to realize, oh my God, I don't want to be represented this way. I'm not the noble savage, or these stereotypes. And it's a big contributor to why they're beginning to shift in this manner. And museums, historically, are just a place to store objects from the past. But I want to talk a little bit about how they've begun to turn into more of a community center, and a place where, where the local community, the local culture is being uplifted and supported. Specifically, museums focusing less on material history and more on being human-centered, on being centered on the humanity of the people that they're representing. Part of this is cultural participation. This is the concept of that people have the right and the decision to access, enjoy, produce, and represent themselves and be represented in their own culture. It's largely an issue of making sure that people creating the culture, people that are part of the culture, are working hand in hand with those specific institutes that are overseeing the culture, for lack of a better word, that are recording it, that are, whether they're a government agency, whether they're a nonprofit, combining those two interests is incredibly important. I wanted to quote a book called Moving Icebergs, which will go some way to explain my very clever image that we're using in the background here, by Steve Patty. And he argues that to create lasting change within an organization, you need to go deep into the inherent values and beliefs of an organization. Every organization, he writes, needs to hold candid conversations about values and beliefs, purpose and meaning. Too often, the institutional culture of museums, as well as that of many nonprofits, businesses, and corporations, undervalues these more personal conversations and the vulnerability required to connect with each other in deeply human ways. We avoid talking with each other about our personal core values because it's too personal and best left to private reflection. And I specifically wanted to include this not only because it mentions the culture museums, but how the reason that it's gone from a house where you put cool stuff to something that supports the community, something that develops the community, is this change in museum culture, both from new blood entering and from new conversations people have been having. One of the best ways I've seen museums work to kind of undo the damage that they've done previously and to really support the communities that they're representing is a decolonialist attitude. The La Casa del Museo in Mexico, which you guys don't know, is it's called the Museum House. It's in Mexico City. It's essentially like the Smithsonian of Mexico, if any of you haven't heard of it before. And they specifically have been moving towards removing exhibits that are post-colonialism, post-Spanish injection of culture into Central America, and focusing a lot more on exhibits of pre-colonialist history and of independent Mexican history, kind of separating themselves from the Spanish past and more focusing on the people who have actually lived in Mexico or from Mexico. And I think this is something that is getting repeated at a lot of institutions, especially those that cover Native American history. I've been to quite a few now that are beginning to either work with local communities to properly represent them or to sort of reverse the narrative that they themselves have been providing. Thank you guys very much for coming to my TED Talk. I was very excited to share all this with you. I'm very passionate about museums. And Professor So, I hope you enjoyed my presentation. Thank you very much.